There we go. All right. So, thank you for listening to Bubble Radio. Today I'm connected with Paul Nehls, who is an English instructor at Yokohama City University, and he's also a PhD candidate at Yokohama National University, specializing in applied linguistics. Thank you for making the time to be on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, and today will be a little bit different from other Bubble Radio episodes. We'll not be putting a main focus on powerlifting or exercise, but I'll be hearing from Paul about his overall experiences living here in Japan. So for those listeners who are interested in moving to Japan, or someone who is currently residing here, might be able to take some valuable information or insights from this episode. So before we get into this topic, maybe you can tell me a little bit more about yourself and maybe where you're from and how long you've been here.
Okay. Well, first of all, in my defense on the athletic training front, I am a runner and I've participated in a number of full marathons during my time in Japan. First one I did was actually Tokyo Marathon back in 2011. And I've done a couple other full marathons since then. So not lifting, but I do know what the training slog can be like.
Have you been running recently with marathons or?
Well, there's not a lot of official events going on with the coronavirus around, but actually the coronavirus has served as a big inspiration for me to get out and do a lot of running, because I guess something about a pandemic makes me want to be as fit as possible in case I were to get sick. Right? So I've been running a lot. In fact, if there were some marathons coming up on the calendar, I would be feeling pretty ready for them at this point.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I did a lot of running over the summer.
Okay, well, I want to...
But I should finish with my introduction to myself, though. I'm originally from the United States, and I've been in Japan for 15 years. Not continuously, though. I was in Japan living in the countryside for 3 years, 2002 to 2005, and then went back to America for graduate school and have been in Japan again since 2008.
2008, so overall 15 years. And obviously teaching in English in Japan must be a very interesting experience for you as well. Can you spot any difference in teaching styles or how you approach students in different countries? Like, for example, as a student in Australia, I was more used to students more interactive, and a good example of this would be all the front seats of the classroom would always be taken. Or when a teacher asks a question, everybody's hands would go up and people would want to shout out their answers. And I feel like that's something different that I've experienced here in Japan. It's actually the complete opposite. Would you have any struggles of that as a teacher?
It's certainly the case that classroom culture in Japan tends to be quieter and more, I guess, space between the teacher and the students, not just in terms of interaction, but even the actual physical space. You mentioned Australian students sitting in the front of the classroom. Japanese students all sit at the back. So social distancing has been cool for a long time between teachers and students, at least.
Right.
But it's a challenge for sure, because if you're teaching English, or I also teach one of my main focuses in my elective classes I teach is public speaking. And you have to be pretty active in class if you're going to learn how to speak and use English and use it for public speaking. So that's certainly an issue. There's certain tips and tricks that you learn as you go through, and a lot of it is about building relationships with your students in regards to, I get the feeling a lot of professors in Japanese universities don't bother in lecture situations to really
That's fine.
Sorry, there's vending machines in the background. Japanese professors professors in general, I guess, in Japanese universities don't spend a lot of time learning the names of their students, for instance.
Right, okay.
And so for me, that's always a point. Like, I want to have my students' names within the first couple of weeks of class, because if you can actually say their names and bring them into class that way and make it known that you care about who they are and what their name is, and also the same thing for between students.
Right.
Have them get to know each other as well as possible, as quickly as possible, so that, I mean, it's just normal that you're more comfortable talking with people that you feel you know than if you're sitting in a class full of a bunch of strangers. So tricks like that, you get used to trying to emphasize those sorts of things to get your classes more and more interactive.
Do they respond well to that? You like trying to learn their names and trying to be more interactive with this individual students? Are they very responsive to that, would you say?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I definitely have gotten the impression it's a popular thing amongst the students, and I actually have proof of that, because ever so often I'll go on Twitter and I will search my name and see, and sometimes I get what students say about me.
What?
Oh yeah.
You probably wouldn't get any bad comments though, would you?
I haven't come across anything nasty or bad, no. But I have come across comments, like a Twitter conversation that was like, oh, Mr. Nehls actually bothers to learn our names. That's really cool.
Right.
So
okay.
I've seen the proof of that method.
Okay. So for those tweeting out,
be careful.
your
I might be watching.
Okay, and also with like the coronavirus pandemic this year, and a lot of the classes that are happening in Yokohama City University is it's happening through Zoom calls and Zoom class. Remote online classes. Right. And what are your experiences with that? Because and especially with what we just talked about with Japanese students not being wanting to be too interactive in the classroom, with remote classes, wouldn't that make it harder for students to have more like a deeper kind of connection with their teachers and trying to be interactive and everything like that?
Yes and no. I mean, there are some definite disadvantages to the online format, but there were a few things that happened that actually I found to be positive about the online experience. And I think the biggest challenge for me is I'm definitely an extrovert. I enjoy meeting people and talking to people, and because of privacy issues when students are in their own home, etc., I can't require that students have their cameras on.
Right.
And so doing classes, talking to black boxes for several hours a day is really exhausting. It's just exhausting because you feel like you're in a room talking to yourself almost. So I ended up doing a lot of focus of trying to get students into the so-called breakout rooms where they were talking to each other and trying to minimize the amount of talking that I was just doing lecture style. So that was probably good for my own teaching style, to get things even more and more student-centered than I already did in my own classroom, physical classroom. And there were some actual really good things that came out of it that I found to be quite interesting. The best example being, I did some debates in a elective class that I offer, and the debates were really good on Zoom for two reasons. One, in the preparation time between debate segments, the students could go into their breakout room and talk really privately and plan their strategy without fear of being overheard. And the second thing was that black box actually became an advantage, because a lot of times Japanese students in a face-to-face setting are not so keen about really attacking their peers.
Yep.
And in a debate, you're supposed to attack. You're not attacking them, but you're attacking the idea that they're trying to get across. But a lot of the sort of rebuttal sections of the debates in a physical classroom were kind of weak and half-hearted.
Right.
But in Zoom, they
trying
actually
not to hurt their feelings.
Yeah, exactly. Because you can see the person there, and a lot of times Japanese students don't seem to want to do that. But in Zoom, when they couldn't see the other team, it was legit. I mean, in a way that the physical classroom doesn't seem to get. So the rebuttals, the actual attacks during the debate were really well done.
Wow. So would you say that would also explain why Japanese people are very heated on something like Twitter, and how if you don't see anybody on face-to-face, because I have a feeling that Twitter in general is scary, but Twitter in Japan is also very scary. And I would read someone's tweets and be like, I had no idea that they were thinking that, or that person never came across to me as a person who would say these kind of things. So do you think like not being in like a face-to-face situation or being in the same physical space as someone would really expose almost how Japanese people are really thinking? Do you think? Yeah.
That's actually a really interesting tie-in with the debate observation I just made. I hadn't made that connection. But yeah, social media removes a lot of the layers to social interaction that keeps people polite. And that's certainly the case in the US or elsewhere, but in Japan as well, like the normally polite, let's have smooth relationships style that Japanese society tends to run on. Even here, social media can get nasty.
Yeah.
And it's some part of it is just you never feel like you're really talking to real people in a sense, and it's just a Twitter handle on the internet.
Yeah.
And you're not ever going to meet them or have to care about what they're like in real life. So I sort of felt this was the case, that Japanese are not that different than other people in this regard from driving in Japan. Because Japanese drivers can be every bit as rude as American drivers can be. And it's the same phenomenon. You're separated from
so true.
You're separated from the people you're interacting with. You're in your castle that is your vehicle, and you don't feel so bad about cutting people off or visibly screaming at people. Like road rage is definitely a thing in Japan, and it's sort of gives example to the lie that Japanese are always polite.
But I feel like I think it could be taken as a good thing if you don't want to see some negative comments, like because everybody's nice to you in person, right? But if you don't want to see the negatives, hopefully, like the really harsh, like heated side of Japanese people, you just don't go on social media, and then you don't have to see it. I guess it's just like you can choose to kind of almost not see it.
Yeah, you could turn it off, but I know there's a lot of people out there that have trouble turning it off. I mean, you get into these Twitter wars or these fights. Thankfully, I'm not really a Twitter person. I'm mostly on Facebook and Instagram. I have a Twitter account, but it sort of just sits there. And but I definitely know people who, can't go to sleep until they've gotten the last word in, or they've seen how people have responded to something they said, and so you end up it's kind of an addiction, right? And that's definitely not good. So it's yes, in theory you can just turn it off and not pay attention, but people definitely have trouble doing that.
For sure. Facebook can get just as heated too, though. Don't you think?
Well, yeah, in a different way. I mean, I feel like Twitter is a little more wild west in terms of people just throwing out comments, because two things: you can interact with anyone, and second of all, it's even more anonymous. Like Facebook, it's usually your real name and maybe your real face as your avatar, and because you cultivate a friends list, the content that can be seen by you that you produce rather is seen ostensibly by your friends, quote unquote.
Right.
How closely you keep your actual friends list to your actual friends or not, that's going to vary person to person, but it's still, for the most part, people you know.
Yeah.
So maybe you do interact with them in real life as well. So it's not going to be as confrontational.
Right. I feel like maybe they have like the things that they want to say is the same, but the way that they say it is, I feel like in Twitter, as you said, it's like more wild west. Like there's no filters, language.
Yeah.
And, Facebook is a little bit more formal. I feel like, I don't know.
More filtered. I think that the word you use is good.
Yeah.
More filtered. And I don't know, but I do feel like Facebook is also kind of the old people's place to argue, though, isn't it? Like it's more young people on Twitter and it's more older people on Facebook.
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you even do Facebook?
I do, but I don't. A lot of the things that I want to see is already on. It's Instagram for me.
Yeah.
And I've been told that if you like visual things, like if you like interacting people in like posting visual stuff or videos, and you should use Instagram. But for Facebook and Twitter, it's a lot about like words, like articles, blogs and stuff like that. So I feel like Instagram is more fitted to me. But I don't even know why I'm doing podcasts then. But but I don't know. I don't use Facebook, only with Messenger, I think.
That's right. Right.
Use that.
I'm definitely shifting as well. I'm using Instagram more and more, and Facebook less and less. But Instagram has a large level of fakeness to it, though. Like everyone's posting their best life, right?
Definitely, yeah. It's just a picture, but I don't know. It's really interesting to see. So that you mentioned like a few things that you've learned from Zoom classes. One being like you're gonna get mentally and physically exhausted by just talking to a black box is one of them, but you work that out around like having breakout rooms and trying to get people to be more interactive. But a good thing about using Zoom calls may be like that if you do things like debates, that they could get more heated than usual, than you would expect to have in like a normal classroom setting. Okay, so those are the points that you've learned from Zoom classes, you would say? Anything else to add? Maybe not.
I did take advantage of the Zoom setup to. I could set it to cycle through. I would just cycle through the different breakout rooms, so I'm listening to.
Right.
I would turn off my camera and my microphone, and I would just go to the breakout rooms, and I could monitor what students were talking about. Were they sticking to the task in English? Were they actually there? And that sort of thing. But to sort of also preserve my sanity, I use those times to actually exercise, which I wouldn't be able to do in a physical classroom.
Well, what do you mean? Like...
I have some dumbbells in my office. So like I would be listening to a group talk in their breakout room, and I'd be just like doing curls or like
why not?
press ups or something. Like because no one can see me, right? Can you imagine your teacher doing that in the front of the classroom in a physical room? That would be weird. But
okay, I mean, definitely
that's my secret, though. I'm letting out my secret. But admittedly, like that was a huge stress reliever for me to be able to do that, because, like I said, it was stressful and tiring to just talk to black boxes all day. So when the students were working on something, I just burn off a little steam.
Yeah, and obviously like you run more and stuff since COVID happened, so maybe that's like a good way for you to get rid of that stress as well.
Absolutely.
And trying to get into the topic of today's episode is so census statistics in 2018 reports that 97.8% of the population living here in Japan are quote unquote Japanese, and I'm assuming the meaning of Japanese here is having a Japanese citizenship. I'm guessing, which leaves 2.2% of the population being foreign nationals. Would you consider yourself Japanese? And also, what do you think? So I'm throwing two questions here. Would you consider yourself Japanese? And the second one is, what do you think the meaning of being Japanese is? Big questions.
First one's not terribly difficult. That second one has a lot to unpack. No, I do not consider myself to be Japanese, as a short answer to the first one. To elaborate a little bit, yes, I do feel I'm acculturated to Japan. Having been here enough years, I mean, I know who celebrities are, I know what to do on the holidays, I know what to do when I go to a funeral. So I sometimes don't really love the term foreigner, which is how people like me are usually referred to, because the connotation to me is like a foreigner is someone who's more like a tourist who doesn't really know what's going on. So I don't feel like a foreigner anymore.
Right.
But I'm definitely not Japanese either. So
what if what would you like to be called as, as from a friend, or if someone had to describe you in a way, what would you prefer them to call you?
Well, if it's like a friend introducing me, I'd prefer they just introduce my name. Like, yeah, this is my friend Paul. Like, not this is my foreigner friend Paul. That would be a little weird. That doesn't happen though. I mean, but if someone was saying, "Oh, I have this friend," and they're referring to me, and he's a foreigner, or he's what would be the other possible terms? Like, he's non-Japanese, or he's describing like where I'm from, or he's originally from America.
Right.
I mean, there's different ways to do it. I've thought about the terminology. Like I said, I don't really feel like a foreigner. Non-Japanese is descriptive, but then I'm describing myself as a negative, as something I'm not, rather than something that I am. If I took Japanese citizenship, I'd probably still always sort of think of myself as an American Japanese, because you don't spend the first 20 years of your life in America and just kind of cease to be American after that. It's not really how it works. Just like, if you went back to Australia and gave up your Japanese citizenship, you wouldn't suddenly not be Japanese anymore.
That's true.
Not how it works.
So it's not about the citizenship. It's not entirely, anyways.
But I don't have a really good answer for what I would prefer to be called or refer to myself as. So I guess foreigner as a default. It's not perfect, but it is what it is.
Yeah. And also, like, you sent me an interesting article about, what is it, a rugby union in Japan, and they were choosing who they would have on their team. And what was it? It was they had these rules that the rugby union has in place to. Their explanation is to sort of protect the opportunities of natural-born Japanese. And so they have these limits, artificial limits, on who they define as actually Japanese. So if you've taken Japanese citizenship, you could not be considered Japanese under those rugby union. If you're not born in Japan.
You're right. Or born with Japanese citizenship, I guess, if you were born to Japanese parents abroad. So like if you've played, if you were born in England and you end up living and playing in Japan and you naturalize, you could be still considered by the rugby rules to not be Japanese. Someone's going to take that to the Japanese Supreme Court, and there's going to be a court case in that, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And it'd be hard for the rugby union to argue their case, because the Japanese Constitution is pretty clear about once you have citizenship, you have all the rights of a citizen. And it's actually one of those sticking points that makes living in Japan a little bit freaky, in that the way the Japanese Constitution is worded, the human rights, as it's worded in the Constitution, are awarded to kokumin.
Right.
So like, I'm human, but as a non-citizen, I don't actually have human rights technically under the Japanese Constitution.
Okay.
And it's been ruled that way. There have been court cases that have gone before the Japanese Supreme Court about the rights of foreigners in Japan, and the court ruled that, well, since the Constitution only expressly affords human rights to citizens, that means that foreigners don't have human rights.
That's taking
I'm not making that up.
Whoa.
I'm not making that up.
That's taking it to a different, to a whole different side of the spectrum. I feel like it's, I don't know.
It's one of those things that the Allies, or I should more specifically, the Americans overlooked when they went through the drafting of the Japanese Constitution post World War II. In the English version, it just says human rights, and it's meant to apply to everyone. But
right.
the Japanese version, which is the official version,
right.
They slipped in the word kokumin. So only citizens get access to human rights.
Right.
And once it's in the Constitution, you have to either change the Constitution, or I guess decide you'll ignore that.
Do you think they meant it to be like that though? For people that are non-Japanese who are not supposed to have human rights, you think that was like a sneaky thing, or that was like the intent?
It sure seems sneaky, but whether it was intended or whether it was just like the translator just did atarimae and like wrote it out this way, or didn't think that carefully about it. Yeah. Although when you're writing a constitution, you kind of want to believe everyone's thinking carefully about what exactly they're writing, because that's what's going to be the letter of the law going forward. So I don't know. I think there's the potential that it was a sneaky thing.
But that would make Japan such a racist country, though, wouldn't you think? Like people who are not Japanese would not have human rights almost.
It opens the door for getting away with things that are racist. But whether that makes, I wouldn't say that makes Japan a racist country, because what people actually do business wise and societal interaction wise and whatever is still going to be up to those each individual cases. And I wouldn't say that Japan is a racist country at all. But the potential is there for abuse because the Constitution has this loophole.
Right. So it could be taken, the word Japanese could be also be very flexible. And I think that the flexibility of that, people take advantage, like exactly like the whole rugby case. You can take that, you can use it to your advantage to suit your needs. And for example, you need to protect Japanese natural borns. That's why I'm going to now make the definition of being Japanese a person that was born in Japan. So I think that's the flexibility of that people can really take advantage of.
Well, there's Japan is interesting for me as an American because America, is obviously imperfect in how it applies and writes and implements laws, but it tries to be a rule of law country in that the law says this, so we do this. Japan has an interesting situation where there's more possibility for discretion on the part of people applying the law or not applying the law. And probably the best example is there was a court case that decided that non-citizens don't technically have lawful access to welfare.
Okay.
So if you're out of work and you're on the dole, you don't necessarily have legal right to being on the dole. Like you could just not receive any kind of public funds for help at all. But that whether the welfare payments will be given out to you or not is still kind of at the discretion of the decisions of the bureaucrats in your ward or your city where you live.
Okay.
So you could still be perfectly fine in collecting welfare as a foreigner in Japan if you were lucky and got nice bureaucrats who just did the paperwork and said, okay, you're all set. But if you have like a law stickler bureaucrat, it's like, well, no, actually, we don't have to give this to you. You don't have any legal recourse. So there's that interesting. The bureaucrats have a lot of flexibility in Japan as compared to the States or other countries, which I found very interesting and somewhat surprising about Japan.
What's like Yokohama like?
Yokohama has so many foreigners here. I think they're just kind of accepting. It's just a pretty open and foreigner-friendly city in general.
And that would be different if you went to a countryside area. They would have
potentially. The only direct experience I could give is I get the sense that the Immigration Bureau of Yokohama is a lot more lenient when it comes to issuing visas, and because that's the other thing, like when you're being issued a work visa, you can get either a 3-year or a 1 year. And it for many people who have lived and worked here for a long time, the discussions are often about how random it is, how random feeling it seems that you get a 1 year or a 3 year. Like, how did they decide which one you got? And I feel like Yokohama actually is more likely to give you a 3-year. Like, a lot of people I know in Tokyo are just given 1 year visas, so that means they have to go back and renew every single year.
Right.
And I think that it doesn't make a lot of sense, because Tokyo Immigration Bureau is one of the most overwhelmed, right? Because there's so many foreigners. I would think they'd want to give out 3 years so they didn't have so many people coming back to renew their visa every year. But who knows? It just seems that everyone I know in Tokyo just keeps getting handed a 1 year visa. That's anecdotal evidence. I don't have any real proof of that though. So don't take my words with caution.
So maybe different. Well, that's interesting, because countryside there would be. I have a feeling that there'll be a lot more strict with, because there's not many foreigners. And
yes and no. Like there's maybe this idea that they have more time and they can spend more time to scrutinize and be more strict. But at the same time, country people, I feel like, can oftentimes be a little bit more relaxed.
Yeah,
So-
I get that image.
And so if you're out in the countryside, you're kind of, you're a genuine part of this community, and so we're going to be nice to you. Like when I lived in the countryside, I've ended up with a lot of friendships with city hall people.
Right.
They're just like, hey, you're teaching in our town. Can you join in this matsuri and carry the mikoshi? And
Right. Okay.
And they would get me involved in events that they didn't have to, but they went out of their way to like try to include foreign residents in various things. And so I would actually say that being in the countryside might actually end up making you feel even more a part of the community than you do in the city.
Right. Sorry, I don't know much about this, but is there like a financial benefit for bureaucrats if you provide them with a 1 year visa or a 3 year visa? Like, is there?
I have no idea. That I don't know.
Because if they do 1 year and then you have to renew it and then they get more money out of that, then
I don't think they work on a commission. So
I mean, Japan's all about money, so I guess like it could be a possibility maybe. If they're making money off it, then...
Well, I don't think it would be like a personal commission thing. However, there is the phenomenon in Japan that when you work for a public entity, and because I work for a public university, I definitely get this. If you're given a budget and you don't spend all of that budget, then they'll just cut your budget next year. So you end up doing whatever you can to use all of your budget.
What do you mean a budget?
The money that you're given from the government.
Oh, okay.
So you've been allotted, let's say your department is given 1 million yen, so 100,000 yen for whatever.
Yeah.
And if you use that full 1 million yen on equipment and hiring and whatever that budget's supposed to be for, like printer's ink and paper and memberships or whatever. You use all of that, then next year you're going to get that same million yen again. But if you only use 900,000 yen of it, then the city would be like, oh, okay, we can save the taxpayers some money. You obviously didn't need the full million, so your budget from now on is 900,000. And so you end up cutting your own budget if you don't use it.
Right.
So most often bureaucratic entities do their best to spend all of the money they possibly can so that their budget doesn't get cut.
Oh, okay.
And it makes sense because there's times, when you need more money. So like if you didn't really need all of the money this year, but next year you might. So having that budget cut happen is going to really hurt. So yeah, the departments are always really gung-ho to make sure they spend absolutely everything.
Okay, well there you go. I don't know, I have to look
I don't
up a
know,
lot
that
of
sounds
these
like a
things.
conspiracy theory for like the bureaucrats. We have to make sure we have as many foreigners get visas every year so we don't get our budget cut. That's
I don't know.
I don't know.
Maybe there's like a financial factor involved in that of like
Could be.
the difference in how different areas are strict and different areas are more relaxed.
Is this a conspiracy theory podcast? What have I found myself on here?
It's really interesting to me. Sorry. Well, just moving into the next topic, which is about your experience here in Japan. Now, I can't back up with evidence that there are like anatomical structured differences telling apart like Japanese face to like a foreign resident American face. But obviously I have to say this because then otherwise I think I would be like
physical
come across as
differences.
like but I think we can both agree that you would come across most Japanese people as someone from a foreign country.
Right.
Right. And with this in mind, have you experienced have you had an experience living here in Japan where you thought you were treated differently, possibly unfairly, treated differently from other Japanese nationals? And even though you have been here for more than 15 years and have somewhat of like a Japanese family and being able to speak the Japanese language and so on, things like that, have any experiences?
Well, just quickly to detail what you mean by physical differences. Yeah, I have blonde hair and I have blue eyes, and I definitely I don't have a typical Asian face shape, like the so-called high nose that they say in Japan.
Yeah.
I've never really understood what that means. It sounds like big nose, which doesn't.
Flat face, apparently.
Yeah, for that which is a stereotype, obviously, but yeah. So I do stand out, and that's definitely true. People wouldn't look at me and think, oh, that person's Japanese. Has it affected? I mean, it does change your day-to-day experience some ways, but it's not a frequent occurrence, honestly. Like, I go through my daily life and my daily routine, and for the most part, I don't feel like I'm standing out. Just day-to-day, go through my work week. Not much happens that makes me think, oh yeah, I'm a foreigner. The occasional times that I am sort of reminded, oh yeah, that's right, I stand out, usually are language related, like someone, like a staff will try to speak to me in English, or if at McDonald's flip the menu over to the English side and that kind of thing. Those sorts of things don't really bother me.
Right.
They're the kind of things that I feel if they bother you, you maybe don't stay in Japan as long as I have.
Yep.
Because if little things like that, like, oh, this must be a foreigner, let's help him out with English. I mean, I almost find like that could be viewed as the staff trying to show good customer service. Like they're trying to anticipate your needs.
With negative intent.
And with the huge tourist boom in Japan these days, it's not a bad guess in a lot of instances that the person is a tourist and doesn't know.
Some people do get pissed off by that, right? Like, the English menu, and then I don't need an English menu, but then they can't speak Japanese.
Yeah, they actually do need the English menu, right? Yeah. No, that's definitely the case.
Yeah.
It does annoy some people. I'm not someone that really gets upset by that. The one that does get to me though is if I've actually already started using Japanese and there's some kind of insistence that I don't speak Japanese, which can happen. Like sometimes it's a panic moment, and I don't hold that against the person. Like the person is afraid I'm going to speak English and they're not going to understand. And when I speak in Japanese, they don't even register that I use Japanese.
Okay.
They just assume that what came out of my mouth was English, and they're like, no English. And
that happens?
Oh yeah, it happens. Like it's like a moment of paralysis where their brain isn't actually processing that I actually just use Japanese. And the other one, that's not the one that bugs me. The one that bugs me is if I'm with my wife and I ask a question in Japanese and they direct the answer to my wife.
Right.
That one gets to me because it's like, look, I asked you the question, which clearly demonstrates that I'm expecting, I did it in Japanese and I'm expecting an answer to my question. So why are you talking to her?
Yeah, it's almost like you're not treated as like a person almost.
Or I'm treated as someone who's a non-functioning person,
like a child almost.
Yeah. Gotta explain it to the parent.
And you also mentioned the one about the credit card where you go to pay and.
Yeah, I'll hand the credit card over. And then they'll hand the credit card and the receipt to my wife. I'm like, that's my credit card. What are you doing?
Right.
With the changing credit card system, though, that never happens anymore because now they all have the machine with the chip, and you insert it yourself, and the staff no longer handles your credit card. Yeah. So I don't have to worry about that, I guess.
Right. So a few things like that. I think so. This is like the second time we've actually recorded this podcast. The first one, on my behalf, it was the sound quality was not great, so we had to, and that was my fault, so we had to re-record this. But I think on the first take, you explained to me about where you're sitting on the bus and a person would come up to you and try to speak to you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the other aspect of standing out is, generally speaking, Japanese don't just strike up conversations with other Japanese that they don't know on public transportation. But that can happen to me because I stand out. Like people want to maybe practice their English or are just interested in speaking to a foreigner, because I've actually had this happen where the person who wanted to talk to me doesn't even speak English really. Yeah. And so we end up having a conversation in Japanese. But still, like, they approached me to talk to me. Yeah. And I guess we're hoping I could speak Japanese. Actually, just that happened recently. I had a conversation with a guy who he loves rock and roll, and we just had a conversation about British and American rock bands.
Okay.
It was all in Japanese, and we're sitting on the KQ line, and it was totally random.
That wouldn't happen.
No, the Japanese don't approach each other that way, right?
No.
But. Right. And it's not always a bad thing. I mean, that was an interesting conversation, for example. And I've also had people be like, "Hey, would you be willing to like do a one-off English seminar at our little community center or whatever?"
Okay.
Which it's resulted in some random like opportunities that paid money. So hey, okay, why not?
Right. Have you had any experiences where, because the examples that you brought up doesn't seem like it was supposed to be discriminatory with intent. Have you had any experiences where you knew that they wanted to offend you just because you look like you look different? Or... Are
we back on Twitter again? Is that what no, deliberately offending. No. The two things that come to mind that can feel a little offensive are the empty seat next to you on the train.
Right.
Like the seat next to me is always the last to fill up, pretty much. And I sometimes the charitable interpretation of that is people are afraid I'm going to strike up a conversation with them, and they don't want to be seen to not speak English or embarrassing that why is this, why am I talking to this foreigner, sort of thing. And the uncharitable is that they don't want to sit next to a foreigner for some other reason. Like I've genuinely had it happen where the seat next to me is open and someone has come onto the train and like spotted the seat and starts walking towards it, and then realizes that there's a foreigner next to that open space, and then like sort of casually does the, oh, I was just going to put my bag up here and I never intended to sit in that seat sort of move. That can feel a little offensive.
Yeah.
But then the other side of that is ever so often, you know, the train will be sort of half full and someone will sit down next to me, and then I get suspicious. I'm like,
right,
there are other open seats that you chose to sit next to me. I wonder why. And usually it's nothing. The person probably, again, just wasn't paying attention and it's like sat down. But
I have a feeling like those moments like that are very indirect ways of being treated differently. If, for example, in Australia, sorry, not an example, it actually happened, but I've had people throw empty cups from takeaway chain shop, like McDonald's, out of their car window when I was walking in Australia as well, and they would call like all different types of names, like Ching Chong, or I don't know, that's a way to be racist, I guess. But they would yell stuff, they would throw stuff. It would be like physical and it would be verbal, very attacking, direct ways of racism.
Yeah.
But the stories that you brought up doesn't sound like it's a very direct way. It's more like an indirect way of, or maybe without intent even.
Yeah, I think there's, you mentioned at the beginning, for people listening who might be interested in living in Japan or are living here already, I think it's definitely the case that you're not going to face physical altercations, those sort of physical representations of racism, like having things thrown at you or having epithets. Is that the correct pronunciation? I've actually only ever seen that word in print. I've never actually said it out loud.
I don't know either.
Racist slurs, like shouted at you. That's not something that happens in Japan. I can think of one instance where someone yelled at me and it was kind of racist, and it was clearly someone who was also not mentally stable. Like when they were not.
They had some sort of
they had some sort of disability. So I didn't really hold that against them. I mean, it's certainly possible. Most of the stories I hear about this usually happens around alcohol. Like incidences fueled by alcohol can happen. Thankfully, nothing like that has happened to me directly or anyone that I know directly. So even that's not a very common occurrence. And I take a moment to point out that there's actually a really good YouTube channel that's about the Black experience in Japan, where Black people, not just from America but from African countries and elsewhere, talk about their experience being Black in Japan. And one of the themes that pops up a lot is that Black people feel very safe here. In a way that they might not in countries where physical racism might be a threat, like the United States or Australia, where there could be threat of physical violence, or the police being more likely to physically get physical with you during an arrest or something. Watching that channel has made it clear that like Japan feels very safe for Black people as well. So in a physical sense, you're not going to run into that. I think the most egregious form of discrimination that I've experienced directly was with housing, and it's a common one that foreigners talk about a lot, and it's the most common example I think foreigners have of a sort of accepted discrimination that happens in Japan, and that is apartment owners are not required to rent to, well, anyone really in specific, but there's a lot of like no foreigner policies out there. So I was actually sitting in a housing agent looking for an apartment, and on the phone he's just openly asking the owners he's calling. He's like, my client is a foreigner, do you rent to foreigners?
Right.
Right in front of me. Oh, you don't? Okay. And then with an apologetic look to me, he's like, well, let's try the next place.
Yeah.
So that's definitely a thing.
And that is, I mean, I'm not trying to protect that, obviously, but why is there that kind of rule? Why does that kind of rule exist of not renting out to foreigners?
Well, you can't say it's not discrimination. It's absolutely discrimination. But to be charitable, it is not necessarily racism. Sometimes it's because they're afraid that language barrier will cause like breach of rental contract because the foreigner doesn't understand the other rules about renting the place, or a foreigner is more likely to like suddenly skip out of the country and not pay their rent.
Right,
So it's absolutely discriminatory, but not necessarily racially motivated.
Right. Okay.
Although I've heard from other people that there are instances of like places that won't rent to like Indian people because their cooking is very strong smelling and the apartment will always smell like curry forever or something like that. I mean, I've heard nonsense like that before. And I did have the very same housing agent I was just talking about specifically point out that I was a white foreigner.
Right.
Which I thought was interesting, that it sounded like he was leveraging the fact that I was white and the fact that I was American to make it clear that I wasn't just like any old foreigner that might be brown-skinned or coming from a developing country or something like that.
Right.
It didn't work. The places were still like, nope, no foreigners. But
yeah,
I did get the impression he was trying to make it sound like I was an acceptable foreigner or something like that.
Okay.
Which I definitely wasn't. We didn't rent any place through that agency in the end. I definitely wasn't.
I mean, you don't really want to rent a place from someone who is like that anyways, right? So I think it's fair that, I mean, kind of good that they're upfront with you at the start. Like being living there and then them being super racist to you, then be like, no foreigners.
No, I mean, every place I've ever rented, I've never actually met the owner themselves, because the owner doesn't usually live in the apartment. It's usually like an investment property or something, right? So, or it's owned by a holding company or something like that. Like I've known people who actually have met their landlady who like lives in one of the apartments themselves down on the ground floors. I mean, that happens, but everywhere I've ever rented, I never actually met the person who owned it. So in those cases, there's not much of an excuse.
Okay. Oh. I think we'll move on a little bit, but this one is a little bit of a cultural one. I'm curious to know your thoughts on the influence of like the historical and cultural values of Japan, like for example, the shame culture in Japan. And we talked about this on the last attempt of the podcast, but I brought up an American anthropologist, Ruth Benedict, who I believe first brought up this shame culture term to light, and she explains that shame culture behavior involves the satisfaction of externally institutionalized social requirements. For this, no inner principle, one's own picture of oneself is necessary. Abiding by the rules and capacity to come up to the socially set standards are all that is required, meaning that individuals are governed not by internally autonomous moral principles, but by externally imposed sanctions. And I had to do a little bit of research on this, and I've actually experienced this form of shame culture in Japan. I was actually lining up to get into an onsen, and you had to pay at the counter. And there was a family, we were lining up, and there was a family right in front of me, and then the child looked really sick. And then one moment he just projectile vomited onto the floor, and he looked very, very unwell. And then the first thing that the mother did was not, hey, are you okay? Like, are you feeling okay? She literally turned around to me and then bowed her head down and be like, I'm really, really sorry they had to witness that. So I feel like the priority is like how people look at you is more prioritized than your child's health almost. I've heard of this example where how you raise your children in Japan is also affected by the shame culture. For example, you wouldn't, if your child was wearing a t-shirt in the middle of winter, you wouldn't say put your jacket on because it's cold. You would say put your jacket on because you look weird in front of other people, like wearing a t-shirt in the middle of winter. And I'm curious to know if you brought up a good point about people coming to sit next to you on the train and that they're scared. No, people not sitting next to you on the train because they're scared that you'll talk to them in English, and then they'll be embarrassed by that. Would you say that this shame culture still exists here in Japan, and if that affects how people treat foreign nationals in Japan?
Okay. Well, the Ruth Benedict book is very famous. It's a little bit dated in some ways and perhaps paints the phenomenon in too broad a brush, but there's truth to it in terms of how the idea manifests in, like, for example, you've mentioned child rearing. In my own family, like, the parenting style of my wife and I is different in that regard. I'm more likely to tell my daughter, don't do this because it's not the right thing to do.
Right.
Whereas my wife would be more likely to say, don't do this because what will the neighbors think?
Right.
And I'm not usually thinking or caring what the neighbors think. I'm just like, you don't do this because you're not, it's inappropriate behavior, but I'm not framing it from how other people are going to be seeing it. Although I guess the end game of that is obviously it's going to affect how other people perceive you. But there's also, I guess, where there's more concrete example possibly that shame culture is more of a thing, is that in some respects there are instances where Japanese will do things that are not good, but because it's not in the public eye,
right,
they don't care.
Okay.
I did a video on my YouTube channel about this weird relation that Japanese have with garbage.
I was going to mention that actually.
Like, it always made me wonder why Japan has such glistening clean cities when it comes to like rubbish disposal compared to New York or Paris or something. Like a lot of tourists always comment Japanese cities are so clean.
Yeah.
But you get so much garbage dumping along the highways and in the forests out in the countryside that in America we just push this message of keep nature clean,
right,
don't toss your rubbish in the woods, and generally speaking people are good about that.
Yeah.
In Australia, Australian people would be just completely appalled at how Japanese beachgoers treat their beaches here.
Yep.
It's kind of an accepted thing that you can just leave a beach littered with rubbish because there's no shame in it.
There's also a sign that says poiste, which is throwing out rubbish, is wa kakko zo.
Yeah,
it's like a sign.
Yeah,
and it's like it doesn't look cool.
It's a bad image.
Yeah, it's a bad image. So don't throw away rubbish.
And so if you're in a place where no one's going to see you throw it away, it's okay.
Yeah.
So that whether that's really evidence of shame culture, I'm not sure, but it seems like fairly indicative that it is a thing. That like, okay, if no one's going to actually make me feel embarrassed by this action because no one's around, I'm just going to go ahead and do it.
Yeah, it's definitely there. Do you think that's like influenced how the distance between Japanese and quote-unquote non-Japanese people of like, I don't want to speak to me in public in English because it's going to be embarrassing, or...
Well, whether it's shame culture per se, there's definitely a very strong aversion to embarrassment of any kind. I mean, of course, no one wants to be embarrassed in any country or culture. I mean, everyone wants to make it seem like they know exactly what they're doing at all times. But in Japan, that's dialed up a few levels. The fear of embarrassment seems to be a lot stronger, which I think is maybe leads to something we were talking to earlier about Japanese people being more shy in general.
Yeah.
Like, if you're really outgoing and put your opinions out there, and the chances for embarrassment are going to be higher. And it's in the parenting, again, the parenting techniques, there's a lot of like, don't do this because you'll embarrass yourself, or you'll embarrass us. Like you'll make us look like bad parents for allowing you to wear that T-shirt.
I think that's mostly the case.
Yeah, it's you will make us look bad as a family by wearing that T-shirt in winter. Whereas I guess that's maybe also collectivist versus individualist cultural differences as well. I mean, because if my daughter goes out in shorts and a T-shirt in December, like, that's on her. Like, if you get embarrassed and get treated like you're an idiot, that's on you. Like, I'm not going to accept any responsibility for that.
Exactly.
But my wife would. My wife would be mortified and like, what the neighbors all think I'm a bad mother and
Right. Well, was it you who told me, it was a very long time ago, about work in Japan, and a worker couldn't leave work on time because he was afraid that when he was coming home, his neighbors would think, oh, he's not working hard enough by staying longer. Like...
I think that was me that told you that, but it wasn't about myself. I was talking about one of my former colleagues who's not at the university anymore. Actually moved to he's Japanese, but he moved to America. But being Japanese, he was actually, his wife told him that because he's in the same job as me, and essentially we're done with our classes. If we've got our preparation done, we typically can leave the university at a fairly typical time for Westerners, like 5-6
Which
p.m.
is normal with my eyes too.
But his wife made some comment of like, you're the earliest husband to come home in our neighborhood, and that's kind of embarrassing. Wow. That's more of like the shame culture as well, taken to very extreme levels too. Well, I have a question for you though. Like, to what extent are the Japanese neighbors, so to speak, really paying attention to you though? Are they really like peering out of their windows and like, oh, that Nehls kid is wearing a T-shirt in December, and oh, the Cannon's husband is coming home at 6 p.m. Like, are people really watching like that?
Some places I think can get really, really scary, like, to be honest. This is one big problem, but my neighbor actually goes through our rubbish.
Oh, I know the rubbish police.
And
I'm familiar with that.
Whenever there's like an English written paper, they will come knocking onto our door and be like, is this your rubbish? You're not supposed to throw it on this day, and I know this is yours because it's written in English. And I feel like I'm being policed all the time as well at home. But I don't know about like peeking through the windows, oh, he's home. But I've had many comments that are like, oh, a lot of people are home recently, because there's cars and there's people walking around, and so obviously they are observing, but I'm definitely not observing my neighbors, but maybe some older people might be. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess if you got a lot of time on your hands, like the garbage police people are usually just elderly people with nothing better to do.
Yeah, it's
I've had that happen to me, like
really?
garbage, and it wasn't mine. Like it was just assumed to be mine because, of course, the foreigner is the one who must have thrown the garbage out on the wrong day. And I was like, you're putting someone else's garbage. They didn't ring the doorbell; they just left it on my doorstep.
Oh, that's annoying too.
And I'm like, yeah. Oh. I don't know if this will make the podcast, but it's a pretty hilarious story. I'll never forget this. It's the exact opposite. It's in a freaky way. Like one time I took it was paper recycling day, and I took my paper. So it's like paper labels and like any kind of wrapping paper or something like that. It's paper recycling day, and I go out and my paper recycling is in a bright yellow paper bag.
Right.
Which, it has to be that's all has to be paper.
Yes.
And I put it on top. It's one of the last bags to go out before the truck's going to show up.
Yeah.
And so it's sitting right on top.
Yeah.
And it's bright yellow. And I go back into my apartment, and I'm leaving for work like 5 minutes later, and basically I just went back into my apartment, gathered my bag and gathered my stuff, and it took like 5 minutes, and then I'm walking back. I'm walking past the Gomi station, and the truck pulls up right at that moment.
Yeah.
And I don't see my yellow bag. and they start, I think, it must have maybe fallen off the back of the pile or something. And the workers get out of the truck, and they start taking the paper, and they're throwing in the truck, and the pile dwindles, and my yellow bag is gone. Someone took specifically my bag of paper recyclables. And I've always wondered why, for what purpose. Like, was it the garbage police? They were surreptitiously going to check to see if I hadn't put any, or was someone trying to like identity theft me, or is there some creepy person who's like, stalking me, or like
that's scary.
Yeah, all those thoughts went through my head. Like, why was my
so they must have been watching you almost.
Someone had to have been watching me at that juncture, and then went out and took the bag. But for what purpose? Whoa. I never found out. I don't live there anymore, so creepy, right?
It is really creepy.
Yeah.
I mean, rubbish is like probably the best way that you can find out how people are living inside the house as well.
Oh yeah, what they eat, what they drink, what they buy.
Yeah.
Where they got orders from, if there's labels. Yeah.
I hope that's not racially driven.
Yeah, I don't know.
I mean,
I'm smart enough not to throw out like credit card information or something, and I definitely dispose of things properly. So there wasn't anything in there that was either hazardous or embarrassing for me, but still it was weird.
Yeah, I think like with the whole discrimination thing in general, if this was racially driven, and I just have like this feeling that, okay, are they being discriminatory with negative intent, or are they just simply, obviously not in this rubbish case, but are they simply just curious because they're so like a different creature to what they're used to, like, for example, if you were in a room full of humans, like normal people, and all of a sudden an alien walked into the room, right? You would be like, what? Like, what is that? I want to know more about it. Or like everyone would turn around to it and be like, oh, I wonder what he's doing. I wonder what he's saying and stuff like that. I'm just thinking like people, foreign residents that are moving into Japan, maybe because Japanese is very closed off, set ways, collectivistic ideas as well. Do you think that they're just simply curious about foreign residents, but not necessarily have like a negative intent towards offending them or making them feel in a negative way?
Well, this kind of goes back to the fact that people will just come up and talk to me as since I obviously stand out. I mean, yeah, I think in those instances it's clearly just curiosity, and like the guy who wanted to talk about rock and roll, like maybe he thought because I'm American I'd be really into American rock and roll.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I definitely think that's the case. It depends where you are. I mean, if you're in Yokohama, Tokyo, there's so many foreigners that for the most part no one pays any attention to you.
Right.
If you're in a highly trafficked tourist area, that's the same thing. No one's really going to pay much attention to you because the residents are, for the most part, just used to foreigners. And it's not a big deal. But if you're off in the countryside where not many foreigners are seen or go, you will get more attention as some strange alien, I guess.
Right.
I mean, where I lived in the countryside originally, you know, I would be the object of attention by elementary school kids, for example. They'd all gather around with that, hello,
Like a mascot.
nice to meet you, and want to play. Like, I'm automatically like someone to play with for elementary school kids out in the country anyways, but not in the city. And not so much even in the countryside. I think, you know, Japan has had its foreign resident population growing, and in the age of mass media and social media, like, foreigners aren't so foreign anymore, perhaps, even out in the countryside areas. So I feel like that phenomenon of being a real curiosity isn't such of a thing anymore. From what I know of people who have lived in China, like, if you still go out into like the rural villages of China, you'll get kind of rock star treatment. Everyone will want to like give you food and like want to take selfies with you and that kind of thing. But in Japan, that doesn't happen. I don't. Back when I first came here in 2002, there were occasionally people who would be like, "Hey, can we take a picture together?"
Right.
But that doesn't happen anymore. Like, even in the countryside, that doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah.
Maybe that's just because I'm old now and no one wants a picture with an old guy. But so I maybe that may actually be a different reason.
Like 2002. That's 6 years after I was born.
Yep. I first came to Japan 6 years after you were born. That's right. You're 24.
Yeah. Well, there's tons of stuff that I would love to talk about still, but we are running short of time, so I will...
And battery.
So maybe last question is, you also have a YouTube channel where you share a lot of your experiences as well. Can you link that to us as well? Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Yeah, absolutely. My channel name is called ExJapter. It's supposed to be a play on words of like next chapter and expat.
Yeah.
And then the word Japan in the mix. It's basically the niche I'm trying to fill is the viewpoints of a foreigner who's been here for a long time. There's tons of vlogs about Japan, but they tend to be like the top 20 things to do in Shibuya, or like what to do when you go to Kyoto, or Japanese manners explained. You know, it tends to be kind of content for tourists or people just arriving for the first time. So I'm trying to give a perspective from more like a long-termer's point of view.
Right.
And the other niche is I like to do walk and talks, where I'm like, I pick a neighborhood and I talk about my topic as I'm walking around.
Right.
So you can just kind of see an unedited Japanese life happening around me, for people who are interested in like just seeing a slice of daily life. And so that's what I do on my channel. I've been doing it for about a year and a half, and I have a new video every week, so I got a fair amount of content by now. So if anyone wants to check it out, by all means.
Yeah, there's you cover a lot of different topics, whether that's like cultural or social or political even. I think you recently did a political one of like, has living in Japan made me more left or right? Yeah, you did that one as well. So if you're interested in any of those, then please, I think it's good that you check it out. So yeah, I think that's about it. Thank you for making...
Can I add one?
Yeah,
more?
of course.
Well, you should check it out because you you get to learn more about the host of this podcast if you do, because I just interviewed Canon for an episode. So if you are interested in learning more about her experience as a Australian returnee to Japan, then please watch that episode.
Yay, because I don't usually talk about myself on my own podcast, so that could be an interesting thing too. So, thank you, Paul, for making the time to be on the show today. I had a very good time talking to you.
Yes, thank you for having me. I wish I could say more about powerlifting.
Thank you.